Good afternoon to everyone. This is Dairy XNet's webinar on how low can we go, nitrogen in dairy rations. We'd like to welcome you this afternoon to this webinar or this morning, depending where you are on East Coast or West Coast. We're very happy today to have this webinar that we are co-sponsoring with the National Association of County Agricultural Agents. Today we have two speakers, and we'd like to ask Dr. Mike Van Amburgh to lead us off. He is an associate professor in the Department of Animal Science at Cornell University, and he has a dual appointment in both teaching and research. His major focus over the years has been on nutrient requirements of dairy calves and heifers and the development of the mammary system as it relates to puberty. But currently he's working on whole animal and ruminal nitrogen metabolism and how that relates to milk protein synthesis and its interactions within the rumen and in forage analysis. So we've asked Mike Van Amburgh to come and talk about how low can we go, nitrogen in dairy rations, and look at formulation and what we can do as far as reducing nitrogen in rations to have a less of an effect on the environment. With that, Mike.
All right, thank you very much, Donna. Get my slides up and running here. Thank you for that introduction. So this afternoon, I'll spend a few minutes talking about how we see this, how we see the potential for reducing nitrogen feeding to lactating dairy cows. Part of that is driven, obviously, from the opportunity to reduce the environmental impact of dairy cows. The other part of that is driven by, well, at some limit or at some point was driven by the ability to reduce feed costs or per day for a dairy farm, but given the upswing in energy prices or energy feed prices, that may not be quite the opportunity we thought it was, but we can still stay focused on the environmental impacts. And again, just a little bit of background to help give context. Some of this is also driven by my efforts. At the moment, I lead the Cornell Net Carbohydrate and Protein System Development project, and so trying to figure out how to refine the model to better predict the requirements of the cows has been part of our mission, and I think we're getting better, but as we get better at it, it means we find more sources of variation either within the model or within the actual feeding system, so I'll address that a little bit also. So just a quick outline, what are some of the efficiencies of nitrogen utilization for lactating dairy cattle and what that might mean for ration formulation. A little bit about nitrogen metabolism, and I'll contextualize it for you and we can come back with some questions. And then mostly some farm examples of what we think we can do in the field when we've understood this better and our ration formulation systems or programs are more refined to predict some of these cow requirements. And then I'll summarize. So I think the place to start is that we have I believe we have lots of opportunities to improve nitrogen efficiency on the farm. Those of you who study this, work with herds, or paid attention to this know that most on-farm feed or farm nitrogen efficiencies run somewhere between 20 and 32%. And obviously that's a function partly of the amount of nitrogen you're feeding, level of milk production, and then also the forages available to you or to the farm, and that has a big impact on your opportunities to control nitrogen intake. High alfalfa forage inclusion rates make it hard to reduce the amount of nitrogen you're feeding to those cows. I think one of the big questions is how efficient can a cow be? And there's some published literature on this, mostly out of European journals, but I think this is applicable. They would, previous literature would suggest that the theoretical limit of a lactating dairy cow is somewhere between 40 and 45% efficiency in use of nitrogen. That's milk N to feed N. And although that may sound quite high, matter of fact, that looks almost double the low range of our on-farm nitrogen efficiencies. I think that's not really that far off, and I'll give you some examples of that shortly. In reality, I think the practical limit within group maybe not on farm, but within group, it's probably somewhere between 38 and 40%. And notice that I said the practical limit on farm is between 38 and 40, and the theoretical limit started at around between 40 and 45. I think it's a really good take-home point, is that if you go through a lot of research studies over the last 30 years and you look at nitrogen efficiency and what we were able to achieve in some of our research projects, you'll find that it's not really all that high, and those 40 to 45% are studies where cows really didn't achieve that. That truly was theoretical, and we were projecting out to what we thought we could achieve if we understood everything. That includes balancing for amino acids. We have groups that are actually achieving that, and there are cows in groups in herds in New York and central New York here that are actually in that 42 to 43 range, which means that theoretical efficiency limit really isn't all as high as we thought it was, and that cows might have even greater potential. Now, to achieve all of this, it's going to require refinement of our ration formulation systems. If we really want to do this and do it well and do it repeatedly, we're going to have to get better at balancing for rumen nitrogen and post-ruminal amino acids. I think the other thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to figure out how to refine feeding management. We're going to have to understand more of the variation associated with feedstuffs, feed digestibility, intestinal digestibility, and then the management of that feeding system around the cows. And so those are things that we'll have to keep in mind. I think one of the things that we also have to keep in mind is that if we want to improve the efficiency of nitrogen utilization, we have to keep a couple key factors in mind. First of all, what we have to remember is that milk protein output is really a function of energy supply first, and then amino acid balance. And that it's really signals from sensing energy supply that really drive milk protein synthesis in a cow, and we can't add more dietary protein and see big returns on milk protein synthesis. The other factor from an overall efficiency and more from an environmental perspective is that urine nitrogen is variable and is really a function of excess nitrogen intake and recycling. And it's the kidney, as we do more work to understand how cows manage nitrogen, what we're learning is it's really the kidney at some level that's making the decision whether to send recycled or urea nitrogen either out into the urine or back into the circulation of the cow so it can be pushed back into the gastrointestinal tract to be used. And I'll come back to talk about that for a minute. And, in reality, urine nitrogen is the most volatile form of nitrogen that cow excretes, and also the most variable. So reducing it will reduce the environmental impact and hopefully improve our efficiency. And, we can do all sorts of things to enhance urinary nitrogen excretion. We can overfeed total protein. I think that is what a lot of us are doing right now. Or we may overestimate ruminal nitrogen balance relative to microbial demand or fermentable carbohydrate, because in many of our formulation systems we've underestimated the amount of nitrogen that cow recycles and the amount of nitrogen that the microbes, bacteria, and protozoa absorb or utilize of that recycled nitrogen. And I think the other problem that we have is that we've got a bunch of nutritionists out there who don't want to lose their jobs, and dairy producers don't want to lose their milk. And one or two of those things, losing milk, will cause a nutritionist to lose their job. So I think the other thing that we've got to work on here is what is the value of the safety factor, and do we formulate to the absolute requirement of the cow, or do we formulate above the requirement of the cow, knowing that there's a certain level of management on the farm that has variation in it, so we have to slightly overfeed protein, or maybe not slightly, grossly overfeed protein to make sure that we don't lose milk. And I did a simple calculation here. We've been doing work now for a while where we know we can get some of these high-producing cows to balance at about 15% crude protein for at least 85 pounds of milk. So that's my example. And again, that's forage dependent. So if we balance this diet at 15% protein at 85 pounds, that's about a 52 to 53 pound dry matter intake package. So at the level of the nutritionist, again, he or she doesn't want to lose milk. They don't want to lose their customer. So they're going to build in some management considerations, and they're going to say, hey, you know what? I don't know if I can feed 15% every day because that's probably right at the limit. So I'm going to go ahead and feed 15.5 to make sure that I cover myself to make sure I don't lose any milk in case there is some error in either mixing or dry matter, whatever the case might be. Well, doing that, if you converted it to a soybean meal equivalent, that's about a pound of soybean meal a day. And, we can talk about the value of that. But when I put these slides together, that was about 20 cents cow a day, or about $36,000, over $36,000 a year. So again, depending upon how you want to do the value and how much safety factor you want to put on there, that could be quite a bit of money for the average dairy farm, and it puts a value to that. To me, it puts a value to that safety factor, and it changes the conversation because it says this is what your management is worth in terms of how I have to formulate the diet, and that changes, in my mind, that changes the way we think about this. I think the other thing we have to do at some point is we have to get over our use of the term crude protein, and that's my purpose for this particular slide. This is from a very nice paper written out of the University of Illinois, and the title was Impacts of Source and Amounts of Crude Protein on Intestinal Supply of Nitrogen and Performance of Cows. And I think it's a nice, simple description of the fact that we can look at a particular crude protein level, 16%, and that's where the arrow's at, and we can see cows making on average from about 45 to 50 pounds of milk over 80 pounds of milk. And the question when you look at that slide is, what's most limiting? Is it crude protein or is it energy? Because I think the other thing that we have to get to when we're having this conversation about how low can we go or how much nitrogen can we take out of the diet is, what value should I be using? Does crude protein mean anything? And do I really have to get to the point of saying, I've got to balance rumen nitrogen requirements and then meet the metabolizable protein supply for this given level of energy supply that's in the diet? And so I think we've got to evolve our discussion away from crude protein because that doesn't really help us refine these estimates. And I think the other thing is we have to just remember that if we're going to have an environmental impact and an impact on these diets, that fecal nitrogen is fairly fixed. So we're not going to manipulate fecal nitrogen. We have a couple examples here from some papers from the literature where we have a range in intake nitrogen from 429 grams to over about 754, and we can see across that range in intake nitrogen that there's really not a big shift in fecal nitrogen, but we're almost 200 grams different in urinary N, which says that across those diets, all that extra nitrogen or a lot of that additional nitrogen was simply excreted in the urine. There were some increases in partial efficiency, but not that high of an increase in partial efficiency as we increased nitrogen intake. It was more a function of our energy allowable milk production. But it says our opportunity here is to reduce our urinary nitrogen excretion. And that's what I have here. I think that what this graph represents are some diets from some of our studies and some work that was done by Glenn Broderick at the Dairy Forage Research Center, where we looked at how a cow manages nitrogen under controlled intake conditions of energy as first limiting. So in this particular data set, we have cows making about 88 pounds of milk per day at 53 pounds of dry matter intake, roughly, in a range in crude protein. And again, I'm going to use crude protein here because I think it illustrates the point, from 14 to 18.7%. So you can see here that milk nitrogen is fairly flat. There's very little increase in milk nitrogen. There's a small increase in fecal nitrogen, And the two of those together, especially the milk nitrogen, very nicely says that protein is not limiting here. That, beyond that 540 grams of nitrogen intake a day, almost virtually all of that additional nitrogen intake was wasted and was excreted in the urine. All right, so it says that we could actually, in effect, get away with about 540 grams of nitrogen a day, and these cows making about 88 pounds of milk. And that break point, in reality, is close to about 14% crude protein. That's what this data is showing us. And then what you see there then is that increase in every unit of nitrogen intake, we see an increase in urinary nitrogen output. And where we're at with the dairy industry and with most of the cows that are out there is we're excreting more, we're on the right side of that curve and that intersection between milk and urinary nitrogen, where we have this more N coming from urine and more N coming from feces than we do from milk being excreted. And what we'd like to do is at least be 1-to-1 on urinary to milk N, but if we were doing a good job, we could be excreting more milk N than we are urinary N. But I think the take-home point here is that under conditions where energy is first limiting, we can see how that flux in urinary N is really a real waste, and that we have opportunities within the cow to make her more efficient simply by focusing on that relationship between milk N to urinary N. And that's kind of how, this is just a screen capture from the CNCPS, but we look at productive N to total N, and you can see here towards the bottom that's 30% in this particular diet versus productive N to urinary N. All right? And then finally, manure N is just the inverse. So productive N to urinary N, 0.9-to-1, and the opportunity there would be at least 1-to-1, if not higher than 1-to-1. So, how do we look at some of this? I think part of this gets back to how do we calculate the rumen-degradable protein requirements to meet the microbial demands. The dairy NRC uses a range from 9 to 11. I think for diets in the Northeast, we run somewhere between 10 and 11. And we rely on feed intake and MUNs to make a final decision. We think that MUNs of 8 to 10 milligrams per deciliter are ideal, but that means you need to manage it well. I'm going to show you a herd example here that runs somewhere between or down around 7. We think that's probably the lower limit. Within the context of diets we've been managing within the CNCPS, we've had RDP levels as low as 7.6 with good performance. But again, those are under conditions of very good feed management and herd management. I'll skip this slide in the interest of time, but what I want to talk about here briefly is just how cows, one of the things that we've underappreciated is how efficient cows are at conserving nitrogen. It's not so much the cow itself as the symbiosis between the cow and the microbes. And the NRC doesn't get this right, and the CNCPS still doesn't get it right, but we're doing better. And if you tell most people, if you ask most people what will contribute more to rumen nitrogen balance, a dry hay or a fermented forage, we're almost all going to say a fermented forage because it contains more soluble nitrogen. So the next question then is, does the cow really care what form that nitrogen comes in? And this is a very nice study that we've done. It's easy to see. They had, these aren't high-producing cows. It's only 6 cows, but it's a very elegant study. They used stable isotopes, 60% forage, 40% concentrate, 14.5% crude protein, 3 different forages. Went out and cut part of the field and made it into a dry cured hay. Went out and cut the same field, made some of it into formic acid treated silage, and then cut another part and made it into and inoculated it with a microbial inoculant, and again made it into a silage. So we had 3 very similar forages preserved 3 different ways. The question is, does the cow care? And what I have in this particular slide is the nitrogen intake of those cows fed those 3 diets. So what I want you to notice is how much of that nitrogen was converted to urea. And I think the take-home point here is that most of the time we would assume, or it would seem intuitive to most people, that the higher the soluble nitrogen coming from the feed, the greater the amount of ammonia, and thus the greater the amount of urea that the cow is going to make. And what you can see pretty clearly here is that that's not true. And we've seen this repeatedly in many other studies, that the cow doesn't care so much about the form of the nitrogen, it's the amount of the nitrogen that she consumes, and that the dry hay, cow-fed the dry hay, made about the same amount of urea as the cow-fed the silages. And then if we look at the urea nitrogen entering the gastrointestinal tract on the right-hand two columns, we can see that the proportion, both on a gram basis and on a percentage basis, is really about the same. So the point here is that cows are obligate recyclers. They've evolved to make good use of this nitrogen. They want to keep the bugs happy. They want to make sure the bacteria have got enough nitrogen to ferment the carbohydrate. So they've evolved to do this. We just have to know that, trust that, understand it, and take advantage of it, because the more of this urea nitrogen synthesis that we can capture as re-entry into the gastrointestinal tract as microbial amino acids, the more efficient we're going to make that cow, and the less urinary nitrogen she's going to excrete, so the more environmentally friendly we are. And I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a couple of discussion slides here on amino acids and jump right to some herd level examples. So we've gone out, Larry Chase led this effort. I've done a little bit, and we've had a couple grad students go out and figure out how far we can move some herds in terms of their nitrogen feeding. And this was the first herd that we worked with to do it, and actually they were doing this ahead of us. So this is a registered Holstein herd that derives a lot of their income from embryos and the sale of cattle. It's a tie stall herd. You can see the 54 pounds of dry matter intake. They're averaging 92 pounds of milk. At crude protein level, 14.4. RDP at 8.6. Soluble at about 34%. Rumen ammonia balance about 134. NDF at 32. Lysine to methionine 3.3. Says that there's still some opportunities there on lysine to methionine balance. ME allowable milk at 99. MP allowable milk at 90. All right, so a couple things to be of note here. The first thing is cows are making 92 pounds of milk at a 14.4 protein level. At the time we were studying them, they had been on this diet for about 18 months. So it's not just something they did for a month and went off to something else. They're currently somewhere between 14.5 and 15 based on their grass silage protein content. But very nicely it says that at 92 pounds of milk, we're a couple pounds off on the prediction, but we're not doing too bad, and the cows are telling us that this is okay. Maybe losing a little bit of a peak milk on some really, really high cows. They considered top dressing, did it for a while, but then decided it was too much work given the amount of milk that it gave them. If you looked at the diet, 54 pounds of dry matter intake, 92 pounds of milk, corn silage, grass haylage, dry hay, ground corn, some bean meal, roasted beans to get some RUP, a little bit of molasses and sugar, some escape protein and Provale, a little bit of urea, Metasmart to get some methionine, minerals and vitamins. So not an overly complex diet, quite functional. Another herd. Again, 53 pounds of dry matter intake, 89 pounds of milk at the time we were studying them, 15% crude protein, RDP at 8.1, soluble at 30. They have their rumen ammonia requirements cranked down just to about 100%. That's really good, hard to do that. NDF at about 32, really well balanced on lysine and methionine. ME and MP allowable milk at 94 and 98. And actually what this would tell me is that if their MP allowable milk is 98, if you really want to be efficient, you could shave a little bit more nitrogen out of that diet. But again, if you're trying to hit some of the high cows, that's probably not a bad way to do it if you're just feeding one ration. And again, the ration's a little more complex than the previous diet. Corn silage that got alfalfa in here, some wheat straw, blended out their corn, a blend of amino acid or soybean meal and amino plus, and a few different carbohydrates in there, and then back to some RUP, a little bit of energy booster, some urea, and then a couple methionine sources. All right, so again, not overly complex diets, but fairly well balanced. This is an interesting herd here in that this is what I call a bread and butter herd, 1,200 cows, 1,100 cows, no BST, no rumensin, twice a day milking, always pretty modest on dry matter intake. Crude protein at the time was 15.8, NDF at 30, actual milk 84, MEO allowable milk 84, NP allowable milk at 91, everything else pretty much in line. I won't spend time on the ration. What I will show you is their productive N to urinary N at 1.3 to 1 and their productive N to total N at 35, and this is on a herd level basis, not just on a particular group. What was interesting about this herd is that we started having this conversation about how to be more environmentally friendly and save some money back when the snow was on the ground in about March of 2009. By about May, they were ready to start making some changes, and by June, they were starting to make some change. And by June, you can see that we were starting to hit the seasonal shift on butterfat, and that milk was still kind of flat, but then it just started to turn up, and that's when changes started to be made in the ration. You can see in that first change, though, they lost the milk protein. They took out some of the most expensive feed in the diet, which they shouldn't have. They should have taken out some other things. We got it back in the diet, and milk protein started to climb. Butterfat kind of went through the seasonal shift, and milk kept going up. What was fun about this is if you looked at the change over time and what happened in the bulk tank, and you can see from at around June when all these changes were being made, they were running on average about 13, and by September, October, they're running down here in this 7 to 9 or averaging 8. All right, so that was a significant shift in bulk tank milk, nitrogen, urea nitrogen, and that would put us right down at about the limit for a herd that I think we could achieve. If we looked at what that meant for nitrogen excretion, we went back and looked at that. They didn't stay on that diet for a year, but they're back at it now. About 60 grams of nitrogen per cow per day, less urinary excretion. 1,100 cows, that's 26.5 tons of nitrogen on the environment, into the environment over 365 days. That's about 40 cents a cow a day in reduced feed costs at the time this was done. So good for the environment, good for the pocketbook in this particular case. One last example, and then I'll wrap up here. I know we're running short on time. This is a herd that's really, really well managed. Not that there aren't a lot of good managed herds, but this is one that was interesting to study. This is the high cow group. And this is one of the herds where I tell you that these cows are achieving what we thought was the theoretical upper limit of efficiency. 59, 60 pounds of intake, 15.8 on protein, 60% forage, 120 pounds of milk per day. For the high cow group, feed efficiency of basically 2 to 1. And you can look at the ration makeup here, just really well managed. There's some BMR in there. That's helping them out, but I think the take-home point here that this herd is averaging, or this group is averaging about 38% nitrogen efficiency. Productive N to urinary N is 1.33 to 1, but the cows in the extreme production levels within this group are hitting about 43 to 44% nitrogen efficiency, which is right up at the limit, which says that, there are cows out there already doing what we thought cows could do, which means we have more opportunity. All right, so in summary, I think we have the opportunity to lower protein intakes and reduce environmental impact at dairy farms. This should lead to improved income over feed costs. I think we're getting better at balancing at the limits of protein requirements for cows. But as we approach that absolute limit, I think we're going to have to get better at many, many things, which means management, but also understanding variation, and it's going to put more intensity on management adherence to SOPs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. What we're going to do is we're going to have both speakers go through their presentations, and then we'll have questions at the end. We ask that you type your questions in the chat box, and then we'll have a question and answer series after Mike McCann finishes his presentation. Our second speaker is Mike McCann. Basically what we have asked is that for a topic we were going to talk about it from a standpoint of the theoretical or from a scientific standpoint, and then we were going to have a farmer talk about how they've actually incorporated practices on their farm to address the issue. We've talked about phosphorus the last time. This time we're talking about nitrogen. And Mike McCann operates and owns the Easy Acres Farm with his brother Peter. They're located in New York, and that farm has been in operation since 1956. And in 1973, Mike completed his education at Cornell and returned to the family farm, which at that time had 60 dairy cows on it. Since then, that farm has grown to 1,700 acres and 650 cows in that operation, and they produce over 14 million pounds of milk annually. He has various awards that he's won for his environmental stewardship and other best management practices. So with that, Mike, I'll go ahead and let you talk a little bit about how you've incorporated some of these practices on your farm.
Okay, thanks, Donna. Now Mike's done feeding the cows, and now it's my responsibility to do with what's coming out of them. And we have an interesting situation on our farm. As you can see, where we're located in central New York, it's a valley-type farm. We have soils are a mixture of deep, well-drained gravel on the valley floor, and then we have a lot of land up on the hills as well. Our hills tend to run anywhere from 400 to 650 feet difference in elevation from the valley floor, and they're more shallow, poorly drained, acidic soils. And but we also have environmental issues to deal with as well, and that's what really pops its ugly head up when you're trying to deal with nitrogen and phosphorus, but nitrogen for today. Our valley floor is actually over the aquifer that runs to our village and a nearby city, which draw their water from there. So approximately, I would say 30 to 40,000 people drink the water out of that aquifer that's below us. Groundwater is only about 33 feet down. It's kind of a double-edged sword. It's a nice way to get all the good water you want for your cows, but at the same time, you better be real careful when you're out there applying manure. And then we also have a DEC-protected brown trout stream running down through our valley, which we have to be real careful of in terms of leaching into the stream. And then 25% of our land base, as of the last 10 years, we've been adding land to the north of us, which is in the one of the Finger Lakes, Skinny Atlas Lake watershed. That's the water supply to the city of Syracuse. So we've got another 240,000 people drinking from that lake, and so we've just opened up another whole big opportunity to be bad guys or good guys, whichever the case may be. So you can see on this next slide here some of the demographics we deal with. This is looking south down through our valley. Get the pointer up there. And you can see the municipal well. You can see our fields are within just about 150 yards of the municipal well, which is that little white dot right there. And so that's how close we get to the wellhead. And that's our land base looking at it from one of the hills. So you can see our land borders the entire village and part of the city right there. Also, because of where we're located in central New York, we're really kind of equidistant from Syracuse, Binghamton, Auburn, Ithaca. Homer is a bedroom community, and this slide here shows it quite well. We have a lot of subdivisions, a lot of housing interspersed amongst our tillable land, which, as you can see where the arrow is, we're doing our best to try to fumigate the area for them. But anyway, it's just another issue we have to deal with private wells and the whole neighborhood situation when it comes to odor. This slide here, we're looking north. The arrow is pointing right at the roof of our barn right there, and as I said before, we're only about 2 miles from the tip of Skaneateles Lake, and it is Syracuse is one of 9 major cities in the United States that still drinks unfiltered water, so that's an issue that we deal with and take very seriously. And then here's the trout stream, which meanders about 5 to 6 miles down through this valley, of which we farm both sides of. We probably operate 75 to 80% of the land that borders this trout stream, so we have all the issues. So balancing imports and exports of nutrients from the farm, more nutrients are imported onto the farm than exported. That's kind of common sense these days. In 2006, for every 100 pounds of N, P, and K coming onto the farm, only 28 pounds of N, 34 pounds of P, and 29 pounds of K left the farm in the form of milk and animals. So the remainder is left there for us to deal with and accumulate on the farm or are being lost to the environment. And losses to the environment, of course, are air can result in air and water quality issues. So our sources of imported nutrients, and we'll just stick with the nitrogen. As you can see, a lot of people think off the top of their head that, man, it's the fertilizer, but it really isn't. 85% of the N coming onto our farm comes in feed, only 13% in fertilizer. We don't purchase animals, so we have a 0 there, and then, of course, only 1% on bedding and other imports. So one approach is to minimize imports and maximize the use of existing nutrients by recycling on the farm. And this is kind of a no-brainer here, the little flow chart we've got there. The cow to the manure, the soil, field crop, and the stored harvest. So in field crops, we maximize production of homegrown feed. We've been pushing that 60% forage level for some time now. And one of the things that we've tried to do is match the crop to the soil resources because of our difference in soil type and elevation. For years, we tried to grow alfalfa and corn on these high hills years and years ago, and my dad was alive and operating a farm. If it wasn't corn or alfalfa, it must be a weed. However, we've learned that to be able to utilize grasses, we currently grow about 300 acres of reed canary grass and about another 50 acres of orchard grass on these hills, and we found out over the years that these what we typically thought of as low yielding soils and fields, when we got into the intensive grass, we're able to get 17 tons per acre. That's as chopped of forage, and running. And as long as you feed it well enough, we could typically see anywhere from 17 to 19% crude protein coming back on the forage samples of this grass. One of the great things about having all this grass is it's a voracious sink for manure, and so throughout the summertime, during the growing season, we try to get as much as we can on there. Demographically, it can be a bit of an issue because you've got everything's going up a hill, but we've found that we could easily put 12 to 15,000 gallons of liquid manure on these grass seedings. I got concerned after a couple of years of doing this that we were overloading the soils, and so we took did some pre-sidedress nitrogen tests on those soils and basically found little, if any, nitrogen left after the end of the season. So we know they're being taken up by the grasses. And currently today, this is an older slide, but I would say we still have some seedings that we put in '98 that are still going, still profitable. And probably at this point in time, I would say 85% of our original intensively managed grasses are still growing and still yielding very well. One of the things that we've done, we put a low-level application system on the back of our manure spreader, and and we try to get over after each cutting as many of those acres as we can. It's not always easy to do, but we try to at least get 8,000 gallons the acre. If we can get back up there and in between cuttings and get it on quickly enough, we try to get even more than that, like maybe 12,000. In 2006, as a result of our CAFO plan, being that we have such high nitrogen leaching index soils on these gravel flats, very porous gravel soils, we were required by our plan to put in a new storage. Before that, our storage just consisted of a pit underneath a barn. You can see the tractor right there. That's where we used to pump out of, and we had about 10 days worth of storage in the underbarn pit. But then in 2006, we built a new storage, 3.2 million gallons, about 6 months worth. And as far as, I probably fought storing manure as long as anybody did because it just looked like saving all the work up for the time when you didn't have time to do all the work. But the fact is, we're able to maximize the use of the on-farm nutrients much better, and reduce the use of purchased fertilizers. We've really cut back on our starter fertilizers for when we're planting corn. It's been a real bonus to us to be able to have that winter's worth of manure to get on there and stay right ahead of the incorporator, and then follow right behind that with a corn planter and really minimize our use of fertilizers. The flexibility to be able to time the spreading and prevent runoff, that's been a great thing for us. Rather than have to get it out of the barn because the pit was getting full, the storage allows you all the flexibility that you need to be able to get it there when the timing is correct. And as you could imagine, you can apply when the plants have the greatest uptake potential, such as our grasses throughout the growing season in the summer. And we're capturing more N by incorporating in the soil at the time of application. We do not incorporate on our grasses. We've seen a number of different systems out there. Some people are having pretty good luck with it. But we definitely do for all of our corn ground. We put in between 700 and 750 acres of corn. And it's a challenge, but we try to stay right ahead of the disc ripper with that spreader and incorporate in less than 24 hours is what we shoot for. And then the potential to reduce air emissions. We built the storage with help or with the advice of environmental cover company from I believe South Carolina, and we put the bolt pattern into the concrete to put a cover on, but so far that looking at another $250,000 doesn't sound too good to me. So at this point in time, we've held off on putting a cover on, but it won't surprise me to see down the road we're going to have to do it, and we'll be ready to hopefully when that time comes. Another way that we're maintaining holding on to our nitrogen instead of losing it to downward migration is our fall cover crops. There's a picture of one of our cornfields right there. That was taken mid-October this last year. And proactive approaches, stored manure for corn crop is immediately incorporated. Sometimes the guys on the spreader get a little irritated because my brother's right on their tail with the incorporator, but it always proves to be the wise thing to do when you see how well the corn comes up. Manure sampling, that of course is a CAFO requirement. We sample from all the different barns every 6 months. Soil testing, every field, every 3 years. Again, it's a CAFO requirement, but it's something that we've been doing since the mid to late 90s. PSNTs, I'm a big believer, been doing this since 1990. That's the pre-side nitrogen test. And then out of that, you make a decision of whether the crop needs a second shot of nitrogen if you're talking about corn. And then it also allows you to customize your fertilizers and tailor it to the crop needs as opposed to buying nutrients that may already be there in the soil and you don't need. But but I would caution anybody on that because you can get a little crazy on customizing fertilizer mixes. We try to keep it down to 2, particularly when we're talking about starter fertilizer for corn. We just use nitan. We use 8 gallons of nitan per acre on the valley ground. But the poorer soils on the hills, we switch to 11 gallons of 1880 on our hill soils, and we've kind of came up with those mixes after looking at averages of what the soils look like on both fields on the hills as well as the flats. Another thing that we do in terms of keeping track of where our nitrogen is going, we do a voluntary well and stream monitoring program. We started this in 1997. Because we are over this aquifer, we do have protected streams. We actually have another one to the north of us as well as the one you saw the picture of. We're looking for nitrates in the water, so we sample 5 wells down through our valley. The 5th one being the actual municipal well that you saw in the first slide. And we do this quarterly and have been doing it, like I said, since 1997. And we do it for 2 reasons. One is to monitor our agronomic practices and make sure that we're making use of our nitrogen and not allowing it to get into the water. And secondly, because when people smell that liquid manure and where we're located with all the housing and all the subdivisions in the village and the city, we're the bad guys. And in fact, our own mayor of our city has coined the word McNure. So with that, you know, when people on those nice days when you wish you didn't have to spread, but you're out there doing it anyway, they're cause for concern because it smells so bad that what are you doing to our water? And time again, I've been able to bring out the data from our well sampling program and been able to show people that their water supply is healthy, that the nitrates are minimal, and it's really not a problem. It's just what they smell, and if I could do anything about it, I would. And last but not least on proactive approaches is to keep a clean and well-maintained farmstead because pollution is perception in many cases. And with enough manure, we can grow grass just about anywhere.
Thank you very much, Mike.
You're welcome.
We'll go ahead and open up for questions. Go ahead and put those in the chat box if you would. We have one here about MUN levels. Dr. Van Amburgh, can you talk a little bit about, from a practical standpoint, if you see higher MUN levels, what are some things you would target to go in and look at maybe in ration balancing to see how to bring those down?
Sure. I think it depends on how high you are. I remember 20 years ago we were thinking that 15 to 18 was good, and then we moved to 13 to 15, and now we're down in that 8 to 10 range. For most of what we do, high MUN simply just mean that we're overfeeding nitrogen. But again, I think it depends on what your forage base is and where you're located. In Mike McMahon's situation, he can't grow a lot of good alfalfa. He just doesn't have the soil types, doesn't have the environment. He can grow some, but there's a lot of corn silage and a lot of grass being grown there, more than alfalfa generally. So that makes it a little bit easier for him to manage his nitrogen intakes. If you're in the upper Midwest in Wisconsin and you've got a heavy alfalfa rotation, it's going to make it a little bit harder. But overall, if you want to reduce your MUNs, we want to do it by just simply dropping the total amount of nitrogen that's being fed. And that gets back to how do you balance for rumen nitrogen requirements and then meet the MP supply. 7 is about as low as you'd ever want to go. And if you get down in that 8 range, I would suggest that people start measuring groups and not just bulk tanks. You want to make sure that you're not limiting some really high producing cows.
Okay. One of the things you mentioned earlier, I'm just going to follow up a little bit and then come back and ask the farmer a question, but you said energy is limiting. obviously in most of these rations, what are some words of wisdom you would have for nutritionists and farmers looking at it from an energy standpoint to capture that nitrogen in the rumen?
Well, I think there's two approaches. I think we all struggle, if you're struggling with milk, you're really probably struggling with energy intake. So, and all of us would like to get more milk, and I think the basis for all of that milk that we want to see is probably forage quality, forage digestibility. That's really the foundation. So my first step is what I tell most nutritionists or most dairy farms if they want to try to reduce their nitrogen excretion and maybe improve their efficiency and reduce their feed costs is don't focus on overall efficiency. Look at that. Again, like in some situations now, we're predicting urinary nitrogen excretion pretty effectively. So we're actually predicting that on the fly, and we want to reduce that so we get to that one-to-one relationship between milk and urine or higher. And that's really the first best step that I think any dairy producer or any nutritionist can take without trying to shift the entire herd on energy status.
Okay. Got a few people typing questions in, so we'll, Mike McCann, got a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
You did a very nice job talking about how you manage your manure on your farm and how you integrate in crops with that. Can you talk a little bit about, from a standpoint of the diets fed to those animals, talk a little bit about MUNs and that type of thing, and how you match that with the crop and the manure management? How you integrate those?
Sure. I'm not the nutritionist. My brother Pete would be the best one to answer that, but I'm pretty good at making stuff up. But seriously, our MUNs run, our tank average is around 9.5. And like Mike said, we have about 55% of our land is gravel soils where we can grow alfalfa. And about 45% is the land where we're growing grass and some corn when we're in rotation, but primarily grass. And it's actually worked to our advantage to be able to have that because, the grass is typically not going to be near as in protein as the alfalfa. So we are able to keep our MUNs at a pretty healthy level. It's been that way for, probably a year and a half or two now that we've been pushing them downward like that, but we're pretty comfortable at that level. Our production, we run 80, 81 pounds of milk per cow. We do not use BST in our herd, and so I don't know. That's our diets are like Mike said, heavy corn silage, some alfalfa, some grass.
Heavy forage also, correct?
Yes, yeah. We like I said before, we try to hit the 60% forage level.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple questions in the chat box. I believe they're for you, Dr. Van Amburgh. Using MUN, because the milk processor reports this, how can you use MUN as a tool then when you observe highly variable in nature? I think they're getting at is when MUNs are highly variable, how can you use that to manipulate the diet?
Yeah, and I think it depends on where you're getting your MUNs analyzed. I fully appreciate the question from Bruce because I know exactly what he's asking. We've been through that. And this was my point about not looking at bulk tank MUNs, and actually if you're going to get into refining this nitrogen feeding, you want to do some individual cow or cow within group analyses, one to spread your risk, get more information on groups of cows, and then be able to make an informed decision, not on an entire herd, but within a herd group. So yeah, I wouldn't make a ration change based on one or two MUN reports unless there was a really, really dramatic shift. And there is some variability out there. I think the machines are getting better. I think part of the problem is that there's calibration issues with some of the machines, and that's something that our testing centers need to be better at. So yeah, analyze for cows, analyze for cows within herd. Don't look at groups and or bulk tanks as a way to make this final decision. And I noticed there's another question there on how did I decide, why did I make the comment about an MUN of 7, and if the comment was if you're in perfect nitrogen efficiency, why couldn't the MUN be 0? And that gets back, and that's why I spent a couple slides and some time on this concept of recycled nitrogen. The cow's gonna make a bunch of urea in the liver, and the kidney's gonna decide where to put it. When what we now know is if you go, on average, if you go below an MUN of 7, what happens is the rumen tends to run out of nitrogen and we go into negative rumen N balance. All right, so it looks like, and I'm saying 7. I think some of the very fundamental literature would say 6. I'm going to say 7 because I don't think we can measure that tightly. But if you want to maintain positive rumen nitrogen balance, an MUN of about 7 is as low as you should go, and an MUN of 7 really means that you should be at a PUN of 8, or within a unit of the PUN, and that's probably the safe place to be. And it's all because of that recycling capacity and ureagenesis in the liver.
Well, I'd like to take this opportunity again to thank both of you for being part of our webinar today. And for the audience, also thank you for joining us. Realize that our previous webinars are archived and you can go back through and view those at any time or view these. Also, the slides for today will be up on SlideShare. You can actually go through and see those. Thank you to the speakers and to everyone and to Marty at Iowa State for hosting us and making sure that everything went well. Thank you guys very much.